think maybe we can jump into it, and I'm sure other folks will trickle in as we go. But once again, thank you all so much for coming to this part two of our Climate Bites series. So this is a free monthly webinar series where we're exploring our changing climate, environmental changes, and actions that we can take as communities and as individuals to build more healthy and more resilient communities. Today we have Catherine Prunella joining us. She is a water quality extension specialist with New York Sea Grant. New York Sea Grant is a federal academic partnership between National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA, Cornell University, and SUNY. New York Sea Grant is one of 34 programs in a national network of research, education, and extension services to support coastal communities. Catherine's work focuses on water quality issues like plastic pollution. She grew up in Queens, New York City, and received a bachelor's in environmental science at the City University of New York Hunter College and a master's in marine science at the University of South Florida. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And the floor is all yours when you're ready.
Thank you. Okay, let me do the always hard sharing of the slide deck, sh or the screen rather. Okay, so I think you probably see the Slido. Let me go into presenter mode. Let me know if it looks good.
Looks good.
Okay. Hi everybody. Thank you for joining. I don't think that we'll be able to turn on our cameras or maybe there is an unmute function, but this is a pretty small group. So feel free to type in any questions or thoughts in the chat or the Q&A and we can kind of just deal with them as they come in. So today we're going to talk about microplastic pollution. I have something to start us off, a little game. It's a hard game. You can either say it like out loud or in your head, or if you feel bold, feel free to write it in the chat. This here is a grain of rice. That's for scale. So just maybe like think about how small a grain of rice is. And then this right next to it is a microplastic that I made. So this is I kind of scraped something to get a microplastic off of it. The hint is that I did this in my kitchen and this is something that you would find in the kitchen next to the sink. Perhaps maybe in the sink or on the sink. Maybe you have an idea based on the color. So yes, it's a sponge. Extra points if you guessed that it's Sponge Daddy. That's the name of this sponge. It's like from Shark Tank. And then here's another microplastic. Again, a grain of rice. And then the hint here is that you could find this again, in a kitchen or maybe in a coffee shop. This is again like a thing that I scraped off. If you have something in your head, it's a straw. It comes from a straw. And then here's the last one. Again, a grain of rice. And then I won't give you a hint here, but you can see it's a little different, right? This is more of like a fragment, and then this is more just a different texture. This came from a fleece jacket. Oops, sorry. So here, this is the jacket, and then I took a microscope picture of what the jacket looks like, magnified, so you could see it has these kinds of big, like open loops. It's 100% polyester, so these are microplastics. And you can see part of the reason fleece is so warm is because of the way that it's weaved. It like traps air. And yeah, so today we're talking about microplastics. So just showing you microplastics. There is they come in all different shapes and sizes, right? We've got these little bead, we've got fragments, we've got fibers. I'll take a second to note that these are all microplastics because we can see them. What would be even harder for me to show you is nanoplastics. I don't know if anybody here has heard about nanoplastics. They're even smaller than microplastics. We'll talk about them a little later when we talk about human health and toxicology, because nanoplastics, the smaller variety, is more problematic. But when I say microplastics, I'm kind of doing a catch-all. I'm kind of referring to both micro and nanoplastics. Wait, I'm gonna pause one sec. Will, did you want to record this or no? Are we
I think it's automatically recording.
okay? Cool. Just checking. I'll keep going.
Okay.
So just taking a little bit of a step back as to what plastics are, right? Plastics 101. Plastics come from the byproducts of petroleum and natural gas, which is one of the reasons why it's so cheap to make plastic because we're already extracting petroleum and natural gas for energy reasons. It's kind of a cool, wonderful thing that the byproduct of that is allows us to create plastic materials. So hydrocarbons from crude oil are extracted and refined, and then monomers are polymerized. I have here a little beaded bracelet to show that polymers are these really, I mean, polymer, I think it's Latin for many repeating molecular units or long chains. They're these really long chains that you can turn into a medley of objects. I mean, I invite you to just like take a look around whatever room you're in and try to like see some of the plastics around you. This after this polymerization, we get kind of a syrupy molten substance, which is cooled and solidified and turned into these pellets, which you can then heat and push through tiny holes in a spinneret to get these kind of spun fibers. I invite you afterwards to go on YouTube and look at like what's that show? How it's made, or one of those like factory videos. It's really cool to see at least plastic industrial processes. And then the plastic also contains a bunch of additives. So there's things like phthalates, which are added to increase the flexibility and make something more flexible. So if you think about plastics, they range from really, really rigid to kind of bendy. There are stabilizers that are added to prevent degradation from the sun or from various processes, so UV stabilizers. Flame retardants are added, dyes and titanium oxides, different colorants are added that makes it, I mean, plastic is often some of the most colorful stuff in our life. And then some of the issue with these additives are the potential for leaching and migration, toxicity, and it kind of complicates recycling. We'll talk about these later. So I was born in the early 90s. I have always lived in a plastic world. My childhood was dominated by Legos and Barbies and hula hoops and like did I say Legos? Yeah, plastic toys, right? But I put this slide in here because plastic is actually a really, really young material. For the thousands and thousands, many, many thousands of years that human beings existed, we used wood and rocks and metal and animal furs and animal skins and plants, various materials to construct our objects. But really, taking off in the 1940s with World War II, plastic production, I mean, plastic was being manufactured for World War II, like think parachutes or like glass. And then there was all this, when the war ended, there was all this plastic and this potential. And so that really created this consumer boom and the disposable culture that we live in today. But just taking a second to note that plastic is also, and it's kind of a miracle when it comes to like when you go to a hospital, everything is very sanitary and it's very single use because of plastic. If you ever like jump out of an airplane and you have a parachute, like that's an incredible plastic material. So I always try to take a second during these presentations to be like, plastic is the reason that we're where we're at in 2026, right? And then this is a paper that is a modeling paper, so it tries to project where we're going with plastics. If you look at the x-axis here, it's about, what is it, 2026? I kind of forget. And so we're at about maybe like zero point 0.6, zero point 0.7 gigatons of plastic produced per year. The projection is that by 2100, within the next 70 years, we're looking at like a tripling of the amount of plastic that's being produced. We are making more and more. And if you look at the colors here, you'll see that this red, the category that is increasing the most is packaging. Anyone who has ordered anything like this month from Amazon, yeah, packaging, right, is a huge source of plastic. And then there's transportation here, there's building and construction. I think often when we talk about plastics, our first thoughts are maybe like the candy wrapper or the water bottle. Maybe we don't think about the PVC pipes that run throughout our houses or the acrylic paint that's painting our houses, right? So we live in largely plastic structures. And then here, this orange one is the consumer and institutional products. And then this brown one, we'll spend a little bit of time on the brown one, that's textiles. And so this slide I'm just going to show for a second. I don't think I need to tell anybody this. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we all kind of understand what the problem is with plastics. We produce a lot of it, and most of it is only used once. And most of that is put into a landfill after we use it. And maybe about 10%, according to this figure, is incinerated, and maybe about 6%, according to this figure, is recycled. I've heard people be like, oh, only 10% of plastic is recycled, 6% of plastic is recycled. There's these really low numbers that are thrown out there. I tried to find something from our state, from New York State. This is from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, their solid waste management plan. I was not able to find really concrete data on how much of New York State's plastic is recycled, but we can see that here to the left, this is municipal solid waste. Municipal solid waste refers to any of the waste generated by our homes, our businesses, our offices, our churches, our hospitals, whatever, right? The municipal solid waste, this figure distinguishes it by weight, and plastic is very light. So most of 32% of the municipal solid waste by weight is paper. Paper is really recyclable. And then we have food scraps. I think maybe through this series, we've learned food is really recyclable if you're composting, right? And then we have about 14% plastics. Recyclability varies. Yard trimmings, very recyclable. Metal, very recyclable. Textiles, not so easy to recycle. Glass, really recyclable. And so if you look to the right, this is the recycling rates for all waste generated in New York State. And this blue line is the municipal solid waste. This is the stuff that we throw out when we throw out in the garbage. They have a total recycling rate for all of these things of about 20%. And only a subset of that 20% is plastic. So I think that maybe the 6%, the 10% of all plastic is actually recycled. There might be some weight to that in New York State. And then I think this is one of my last slides on just plastic generally. I find that myself included, folks don't really know what these numbers mean. On, if you look at like a piece of plastic, sometimes it'll have this designation. This is just pointing out that the number refers to the type of plastic. There's many different types of plastic. We don't really need to get into the details of each. But generally speaking, the higher the number, the harder it is to recycle it. So numbers that are like 1 and 2, PET, HDPE, these are recyclable. 3, okay, we're getting into more difficult to recycle PVC. 4, this is like films and bags. This can clog up recycling machines. So some municipalities don't accept this for recycling. And then 5 can be recycled, but you have to check. And then 6 and 7. 6 is polystyrene. This is kind of like our food containers. This is not, it really can't be recycled. And then 7 is like a catch-all, and that's often not recycled. So that's kind of my plastic 101, some of the recycling. Going back to thinking about microplastics and nanoplastics. The formal definition of microplastics is that they're small plastic pieces or fibers that are less than 5 millimeters. 5 millimeters is about a grain of rice, or maybe like the length of your pinky nail. So if you want to kind of picture how small microplastics are, a grain of rice. Nanoplastics are anything smaller than 1 micrometer. Those are pretty much invisible to the naked eye. And the nanoplastics, because of their really small size, they have the more potential to cross into biological barriers inside the human body. We'll talk about that. So there are primary microplastics. These are like nurdles. I love that word. And they're kind of pretty, right? This is from the state DEC. I think unfortunately this is nurdles that were spilled into the Hudson. But so there's primary microplastics, which are like pellets and beads. And then there's secondary microplastics. And these are the ones that when I showed you that guessing game, those were all secondary because I kind of scratched them off of materials. Again, here's our grain of rice, and here's just some fibers. And then, with a water bottle, if you pretend like you're a water bottle sitting in your car, I don't know if anybody's come back to a really hot water bottle and they're like, oh, this feels different. Heat and light, and if it's in the ocean, waves, different reactions cause degradation and cause bigger pieces of plastic to break off into microplastics or nanoplastics. So, microplastics have been found in some really wild places. I mean, this is like crazy to me. The Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the world's oceans, and they have found microplastics in amphipods living in the Mariana Trench. Here's like a little fiber that they found. And then this is a figure from Antarctica. They have found microplastics in Antarctic snow. So we know that microplastics are probably transporting over really large distances via wind, via currents. But if we just look in our backyard, so here, this is a figure of the 10 most commonly found items during the Riverkeeper River Sweep. So every year, Riverkeeper, this organization, it organizes a cleanup across the entire Hudson River. The next one is May 2nd. If you're looking for something to do on a Saturday, I think there's a few sites in Albany. And so they collect, it's just a cleanup, it's a coastal cleanup, and they quantify the top 10 most found items. I'm always so interested in this. The top is plastic pieces, probably microplastics, right? They don't exactly say that, but we're assuming plastic pieces. I mean, maybe they're not, maybe they're a little bit bigger than 5 millimeters, but broken apart pieces of plastic are the number one item they find during this cleanup. And then we get foam pieces. Oh my gosh, anybody who's had to open up like a packaging that has styrofoam in it, and then you have to like it's like impossible to get all the foam. It's horrible. So foam pieces, and then cigarette butts. This is something that I think is lost on a lot of people. Cigarette butts are made from a synthetic fibrous material, and so they're not cotton. They don't naturally biodegrade. They stick around. And then all the other things you would expect: food wrappers, plastic bottles, bottle caps, glass, etc. And in the Hudson River, this is a really pretty figure that shows some of the wonderful animals that we have in the Hudson, right? Our great blue heron, our sturgeon, striped bass, just it's such an incredible ecosystem in our backyard. And the reason that microplastics are problematic, especially for our aquatic species, is because of a process called bioaccumulation or biomagnification. So something really small, like a shrimp, might eat a microplastic, and then something bigger, like a sturgeon, eats the shrimp, and that microplastic is transferred. Or we humans eat the shrimp, and that's how we get exposed to microplastics. So microplastics are a lot like any pollutant in that they have the potential to move through a food web. Right? And our food web is all interconnected, and that's part of the reason why we care about these pollutants going into our rivers. I have a couple of figures here of just some data about microplastics in the Hudson River. This is a little bit of an old study. This is from 2017. And in terms of microplastic research, at this point, 2017 was like 1,000 years ago. We have learned so much. But anyway, they took a boat along the entire length of the Hudson River, looking for the number of microfibers. So these are specifically looking at fibers. And if you're savvy, you might see, I think this is Poughkeepsie, the hot spot, because of a wastewater treatment facility. And so there's some hot spots. I think one of the points of this is they just found a lot throughout the Hudson. This is from New York City, Hudson River Park. They've been looking at the balluses of seagulls. I don't know if anybody knows what balluses are. They're essentially regurgitated material, so it's like seagull vomit. And oh my gosh, these seagulls are eating so many microplastics. They're finding a lot of microplastics in the seagull, the regurgitated material. And then this, I mean, if you want to go from the opposite, from New York all the way up to the Adirondacks, this is a recent study from last year where they sampled Lake Tier the Clouds. That has an elevation of over 4,000 feet. It's in the high peaks of the Adirondacks, if I have any Adirondacks 46ers here. This is a very frequented, there's a trail, people hike here a lot. And then they also sampled Moss Pond, which was really nearby, but really remote, like really difficult to get to. And they found that in the Lake Tier of the Clouds, in the lake that has much more hiking traffic, they found a lot more microplastics than they did in this Moss Pond, which is much more remote. So their major finding from this study was that hikers are a source of microplastics to this lake, which is kind of disappointing because we all, like a lot of us hikers are all about leave no trace. We wouldn't throw our food wrapper on the ground, but we do wear a lot of synthetic materials, synthetic shoes, synthetic jackets, etc. And these things are apparently shedding into some of these really remote water bodies. And then I think this is my last Hudson River slide. This is a study that came out from Sarah and I think what 2 years ago. So looking at the Tomhonock Reservoir in Pittstown, New York. I might be screwing up pronunciation. This isn't my neck of the woods, but this is the drinking water source for Troy, New York, and a sub watershed of the Hudson River. And so they did some sampling and they found two things. They found, first of all, they were dealing with so much contamination. This is another thing that we'll get to. It's really difficult to measure microplastics in a lab. If anybody has ever walked into a lab, everything is made out of plastic. Your pipettes, your jacket, the hood, everything. Your bottles, your gloves. And then also using any sort of tap water, there's often microplastics in the water itself. So that's just, there was a big contamination issue. And so they did a lot of different sampling, but they had to throw out a lot of that data. And they were able to they had quality data for one date towards the end of the season, I believe, when they kind of nailed in all their methods. And they found that there was microplastics in all their samples. Something that I find really interesting is that this blue is fiber and this orange is all other microplastics. And so in at least two of these sites, they were finding that there was more fibers than anything else. So let's just take one, maybe two slides to talk about fibers. Everybody maybe take a second and just feel the shirt that you're wearing. We'll do a little grounding exercise. Just like feel it on your skin, maybe look at it and take a second to guess. What do you think your shirt is made of? Maybe you already know this. Maybe, you're one of those people. But if you don't, take a second to make a guess. What do you think your shirt is? You could say it to yourself. You could put it in the chat, whatever you want. Personally, I think I actually have to check my clothing tag. Usually I check beforehand. Okay, so mine is 100% cotton. Does anybody have something that isn't 100% cotton? So the point being, and I think we know this, but just to emphasize, materials like cotton, hemp, linen, wool, down, these are plant-based, these are animal-based, they're quote unquote natural, quote unquote, right? And then there's the majority of textiles that are being produced today are made out of materials like polyester, nylon to a secondary degree, acrylics, elastanes, spandex. These are synthetic fibers. And so that's part of the reason why we're finding so many fibers in our water. I mean, in the Hudson River, it's like, whoa, what are all these fibers coming from? Well, part of them are coming from laundry, right? We wash our clothing, we put it in the washing machine, and then where does the washing machine water go? Well, it might go to a wastewater treatment facility if you live in a more urban area like Albany or New York City. And then the wastewater treatment facility will capture some of those fibers, but some of them are going to leak through and end up in our water systems. Some of them are going to get captured in that solid sludge product that's produced during wastewater treatment. That product, that sludge, is sometimes used in agriculture, sometimes it's incinerated. Either way, it's probably possessing some significant portion of microplastics. And then the rest of it goes into the water. And then if anybody here is, hopefully everybody who does laundry has cleaned out their dryer lint because that's a fire hazard, right? But if you cleaned out your dryer lint, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's also emitted into the air through laundry. I'm bringing this up because I think this is really interesting. There's a piece of policy that's being proposed in New York State that would require all new washing machines sold after 2027 to include a microplastic filter. This is a bit of like, I don't know. I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see. Bills have been proposed in other states, and pretty much this exact bill was vetoed in California. So it might be a long shot, but it's kind of an interesting push because this policy is being proposed. There are industries like Samsung that are preemptively responding. So now you might, within the next 10 years or so, start to see things like microfiber filtration systems being sold and advertised. And right now they're all external, but this policy is proposing to have it internal, so it's inside the washing machine. The way you buy a car and it just like has a catalytic converter, you don't have to buy something separate to manage your emissions. The idea is that you would buy a washing machine and there would be something in there that's already capturing microplastics. Okay, so a little bit about the timeline of this contaminant. It's kind of recent. It's kind of new, and it's very much a hot topic, right? I'm sure I would love to in the chat if anybody wants to tell me, like, have you seen any TikToks on this or any articles, or has your any family members texted you something? I'm just curious because it is a very much something that folks are talking about. A little bit of a timeline, right? Okay, so maybe within it's 2026, within the last 10 years, microplastics have been discovered. I will say, shout out to my oceanographers. Microplastic research pretty much started with ocean science and marine debris research. And now the emerging kind of research is finding it in different parts of the human body. And this is the Google history of every time, or it's the history of folks Googling the term microplastics. So this says 2018, if you can't see, and then this says 2026. So, okay, pre-pandemic, there's a little bit of people Googling microplastics. And then, okay, up to maybe 2022, within the last like 5 years, the amount of times people have been Googling microplastics has been like skyrocketing, right? This is really speaking to it as a hot topic. And then some of the queries that are the most popular, sure, what are microplastics? But then bottled water microplastic, microplastics in humans, microplastics in tea bags, consumption, blood. So let's just go through a couple of these. So bottled water, right? This is a study that I'm a little biased because one of the authors, Bejan Yan, is a collaborator of mine. He's at Columbia University. This is a study that found a ton of nanoplastics in bottled water. I can't really make sense of this number. If you can make sense of it, let me know. 240,000 plastic fragments per liter. Okay, it's a lot, right? And they're nanoplastics. So part of the reason this paper was so cool was that they used this like novel methodology, SRS microscopy, to see really, really tiny plastics that were inside bottled water. And then some of you might have heard of the microplastics in tea bags. There was a study here. This is a picture of what those particles look like after they steeped a tea bag in hot water and then filtered that water onto a filter that was small enough for them to capture the microplastics. So there was some research that showed that when you heat up a tea bag, if the tea bag is made of a synthetic material, it's leaching microplastics. This one is, I just couldn't put it all on a slide. There are so many studies that are emerging about the different food items where it's found, different types of protein, salt, sugar, honey. There was one that came out last week about strawberries. I couldn't really list them all, but microplastics, the point is that micro and nanoplastics are being found in food. And so that's why probably a popular Google search is microplastic consumption. And then there's a bunch of studies that have been finding it. This study is from 2022, 2024, 2024, just to give you an idea of how recent this research is, finding microplastics in blood. And then we'll maybe take a couple of slides to talk about this study. This is published last year, and well, it was published online in early 2025 about finding micro and nanoplastics in the brain. I'm curious if anybody here heard about this study. So this is kind of a interesting and spooky study where they studied. Okay, let's zoom in on this figure here, right? The y-axis is polyethylene concentration, and the x-axis we have liver 2016, liver 2024, kidney 2016, kidney 2024, brain 2016, brain 2024. So these were folks who passed away in 2016 versus 2024, looking at various organs in their body to look for micro and nanoplastics. One of the findings was if you look here, this is the brain column. The brain had the most concentration of microplastics relative to these other parts of the body. And the folks who died in 2024 had on average, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a spread here, had on average more microplastics than folks that had passed away in 2016. And that's why, going back a slide, the article is called Bioaccumulation of Microplastics in Human Brains, because the idea that the authors hypothesized was, is there more and more building up in the brain that would make somebody who passed away in 2024 have more microplastics than 2016. The other finding is this figure right here. This shows that the folks who had been diagnosed with dementia before passing away had more brain microplastics than folks that had not been diagnosed with dementia. So more micro and nanoplastics were found in brains of deceased people with dementia. Now, this is a really, really important point. This does not establish causation. This is correlation. We are finding a correlation between dementia and micro and nanoplastics. We need a lot more research to get to that causal point. So I am not saying that microplastics causes dementia, but these relationships are starting to emerge in the research. This is, I think, one more, maybe two more slides on a study that found that correlation, right? This was looking at carotid artery plaque in 257 individuals. And they found that in over half of the plaque, I'm a I'm a marine scientist, so please excuse my butchering of toxicology. But yeah, plaque found in the human heart, right? Over 50% of those patients had plastics in the carotid artery plaque, and most of that plastic was polyethylene. Now, this is the correlation point. Patients with plastics in the plaque had a higher risk of strokes, heart attacks, and death. And they even say, I put a quote here because I thought the quote was really important to highlight. They wrote this in the article. It is important to note that our results do not prove causality. But again, they're finding this relationship with plastics and plaque for patients who had strokes, heart attacks, or who had died. I think this is my last spooky slide, just kind of summing up some of the information. So micro and nanoplastics, this is what we think so far. We think, and we is the royal we, the scientific community thinks that micro and nanoplastics can trigger inflammation, oxidative stress. So the particle itself inside the body might be causing that inflammation, but then there might also be, it might be a vector carrying chemicals or pathogens that could cause problems. So a microplastic might be a surface that other chemicals can get stuck to. And then there are plastic associated chemicals, like I mentioned phthalates, which are added to plastic to make it more flexible. These are linked to endocrine disrupting reproductive issues in toxicological studies. But kind of the bottom line is we need a lot more research to really understand toxicity and health impacts, right? If you remember my timeline, having a lot of human health studies over the last 5 years is awesome and more are coming, but it's just not enough to really establish what these particles are doing to people. I'll end this section of the talk with a meme. Because yeah, I like memes. Yeah, so if you're feeling like remember that your grandparents had to deal with lead exposure because they used to add lead to gasoline and they used to put lead in paint and the kids were eating the paint chips and getting exposed to lead. And then we also thought asbestos was a really good idea because it's a great insulator, but now we know that asbestos causes problems. And so the way that the history of our industrial world works is that we use a material, we use it a lot, we find out that it's probably not so good for us, and then it gets regulated and it gets managed. And that I think is going to be the future of microplastics. So let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions that are emerging or some of the developments that are happening in tackling microplastic pollution. So let's start with legislation. I'm realizing now this is not really legislation, but let's talk about it. So this happened 2 weeks ago, April 2nd, 2026. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they announced two things. The first thing is that microplastics, for the first time, is going to be added to a contaminant candidate list. What this means is that there is a list, it's called the Contaminant Candidate List, it's managed by the EPA, that lists drinking water contaminants that are known or anticipated to occur in public water systems but are not currently regulated. So there's a list of things contaminants that we know are probably in water, but they're not being managed yet. And microplastics has now been added to that list. So this is the first step in a really, really, really long process that could eventually lead to microplastics being regulated in drinking water. So microplastics are not yet regulated. This is the first step of the EPA taking action to regulate microplastics in drinking water. The other thing that happened was that they released a ton of funding to better understand the effect of microplastics on human health. So I already know some researchers who are scrambling to write their proposals. So it's kind of a good thing, right? More funding, more research, and now the federal government is seriously considering microplastics amongst a potential contaminant list. So that was 2 weeks ago. This was a little while ago. I want to share about the microbead ban. I don't know if anybody here has heard about this. When I started my career as an environmental scientist back in like 2012, this was kind of a big deal back then. Also, so I used to wash my face with this. I liked the smell. If anybody remembers. So basically, they used to add micro beads, microplastic beads to face wash because it was an exfoliant. They added it to a couple of other products, but I'm using the Neutrogena face wash here because I literally used to use this product. Um, so these microbeads were being added to this product, and they were flushing through our water system, and we were finding them in the Great Lakes. Actually, a lot of this work, the first work, happened in New York State and our Great Lakes communities. So first, there was kind of this NGO stands for non-governmental organization. There was this kind of nonprofit awareness building campaigns, stop the beads, ban the beads. That was kind of the first couple of steps. And that was paired with really cool research happening in the Great Lakes where they were finding these microplastic, or I'm sorry, these microbeads specifically. And then states started to ban microbeads from cosmetic products. I think the first state was Illinois. I don't actually know if New York ever got the ban on, but they did certainly propose it. And the way that, state level bans work is that Neutrogena doesn't want to make a different product for Illinois than it does for, say, California, right? If there's a ban in Illinois, they're going to change their product so that they can sell it anywhere. And so industry started to align and they started to voluntarily remove microbeads from cosmetic products. And then that led to this was one of the last things that Obama did before he left office, the 2015 Microbead Free Water Act, bipartisan, by the way. So now when you buy St. Ives face wash, you can look in the ingredients and the ingredient will be sand. They're still using an exfoliating material, but instead of using a microplastic, they're using sand, which is more natural. This is something that our state has done, not necessarily to target microplastics, but to target plastic pollution. So beginning in 2020, I believe, right? Carry out bags. So, when you're going to like take out or things like that, these are banned from being distributed in New York State. So there's the Bring Your Own Bag campaign. Some of you might be thinking, oh, well, what about my bodega that gives out plastic bags? There are enforcement issues with this. We could talk about that if you want during the discussion. But so plastic bag ban, and then we also have a foam-free ban. I'm sorry, a foam ban in New York State, which started a couple of years ago. And then I'm in New York City. There's something called the Skip the Stuff, which means that restaurants don't automatically give you plastic utensils. You have to ask for them. Um, and then here is something that's currently being
Catherine, I'm sorry, I just can I interrupt for a second? I'm having a little bit of issues with your audio. I don't know if you want to maybe turn off your camera and see if that improves it at all. It's just like a little robot
yes.
sounding occasionally.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me
No
now?
worries. It sounds much better now.
It sounds better. Okay, should I
Yeah.
go back? Or I could just keep charging
No,
forward
no,
if any.
I think we could all hear what you were saying, but it was just like a little bit of static and feedback here and there. But I think we
Okay,
all, yeah. Thanks. Sorry about that.
apologies. The Wi-Fi. All right,
Yeah.
well, anyway, okay, so currently there is some New York State legislation that's in the works, we'll see where it goes, called it's referred to as extended producer responsibility bills. This is another way of saying like product stewardship. So this kind of legislation is already in place for tires, paints, electronics. I grew up working at my family's mechanic shop. When we would sell tires, we would have to charge a tire tax or like a tire fee to the customer, and then we used that money to pay a tire recycler. So the idea was that for every tire that we sold, we charged a fee that we then used to recycle all of the tires that we received. In other words, it requires companies to be responsible for the products that they're selling. In this extended producer responsibility, there's a couple of bills. One of them, the big one, is called the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. I think they call it PREA. This would require companies to reduce their plastic packaging. So these bills right now are really kind of targeting packaging in particular. And it would also require some toxic chemicals to be removed. It would impose a fee, and that fee would go towards improving recycling infrastructure. So I think that the fee would be determined by how recyclable the material is, or how much of the material is made from recycled stuff. So this is currently I think it's in Albany. Some of you might know better than me. I'm not really on the policy side, but it's kind of failed to make it out of committee last year, and we're going to see what happens this year. So, my just talking about some of the technology. Part of the reason that I'm talking about all of this is because I'm funded along with Columbia University to develop some technological solutions that can reduce microplastic pollution in water. So one of them, I kind of mentioned this before. My partners at Columbia University are developing a filtration system that would go inside washing machines. So here's an example of the filter. I think I have a picture of some of the filtered material. So this is like, these are fibers, these are polyester fibers that are coming out and getting filtered through this machine. They're in the process of developing it, and it would be something that gets installed inside the washing machine before you even purchase it. Another example, here, just looking at this one first, this is being developed at Cornell University, actually. So this might, there's not a lot of scale, but this is actually kind of small. This is a robot that would go through the water and use a screen to filter microplastics out of the water. Like, let's say a lake or a pond. I think it's really designed for smaller bodies of water. It's called mollusca. So this is something that you would be able to put in the water, and that it would filter microplastics out. I'm sharing the examples of the ones that New York Sea Grant is partnering with universities to work on, but trust me, there are academic and industry groups across the world that are trying to develop technology like that. It's a bit of like a push for innovation. Who can create the best filters to remove microplastics? How do those get marketed? How, do consumers buy it? Who ends up buying them, etc. And then the boat to the right is a little different. This is big. This is a very large device that Columbia University is developing and would one day want to launch on, say, like the ocean. This boat is using artificial intelligence to pick up plastic. So these kind of cases that you see, and by the way, this is like we put it in the water last week to see if it worked, to see if it can like run. So this is very much in the early stages of development. But these computers, there's solar panels here that give electricity to the whole thing, and there are cameras that you can't really see. But the idea is that the boat would go through the water, and there would be a camera, and the camera would take a picture or look at some object that's floating in the water. And if that object is plastic, the boat is robotic, it has these robotic arms. It would then grab that plastic and put it in a net, which we would then have to we would have to figure out what to do with all this plastic in the net. But the first step is trying to build an artificial intelligence system that can pick up plastic that's floating in the water. And so if you have any photos on your phone, if you're like me at all, and you see a piece of floating plastic and you take a photo of it, I doubt that many of you have, we are looking to crowdsource as many photos as possible of floating litter because we need a lot of photos of floating plastic to train our AI model. So we have a website, and I could put this information in an email or in the chat afterwards, called mycoast.org/New York, where we're collecting photos of marine litter to help train our AI our image library essentially. And then I have a pamphlet I can send you, which has some instructions. And yeah, so that's one piece of technology. Kind of jumping to a different topic, there's also okay, so you can collect plastic out of water, but then what do you do with it? Right? Do we just recycle it? Do we put it in a landfill? There's some pretty novel and kind of weird sci-fi exciting methods that are emerging to try to depolymerize or really change plastic into something that can be broken down. So here to the left, we have an image of mealworms. There are worms that eat plastic. Some of you might have heard about this. When you go to like a landfill, and you look at a piece of plastic that's been sitting in the landfill, the microbiome is very distinct. They're calling it the plastosphere. There's these distinct bacteria and fungus and worms, and we're finding little things that like to eat plastic. Okay, where are we going? I don't know. We'll bioengineer a bunch of mealworms. I'm not sure. But we are finding that there are worms that eat plastic. This is a picture of fungus. There's fungi, fungus enzymes that are breaking down plastic, and there's bacterial enzymes that are breaking down plastic. So maybe we can find some biological ways to degrade plastic. There are non-biological, there are chemical ways to break down plastic, but those we'll save those for a different conversation. And then there's also alternative materials. This is my favorite coffee shop. They sell plastic straws. And if you drink your coffee within the first like hour, at some point I will say the plastic straws start to get pretty soft. But in the beginning, a plastic straw is, I don't know, I'm sorry, I keep saying plastic, a pasta straw. So the pasta straw does tend to break down a little bit, but it is kind of a fun way to avoid plastic. In the middle here, this is a company called Sway. I can't vouch for this company, but I've seen them give a couple of presentations. They're making bags and packaging material out of seaweed. So seaweed is a naturally occurring polymer. The benefit of this is that maybe this bag will break down and disappear. If you put it in your compost pile, you can come back in a couple of years and it won't be there anymore. There are, definitely caveats with all these alternative materials. There are questions like, can this really biodegrade in your compost pile, or do you need like a specialized facility? Some of you might have bought, they call them compostable bags. A lot of those compostable bags, you probably need to put in a very specific sort of environment for it to actually break down. If this bag blew into the ocean where it's cold and dark and there's a, specific set of microbial activity, would it be able to break down? I'm not sure. And then what chemicals do you need to use to create something like this? I'm not sure. A lot of these ingredients are proprietary. But anyway, there are some plastics that are being made out of alternative materials. This is a cool one, mushroom leather. Um, Bioplastics. This is just pictures from a workshop I hosted so this wasn't vegetarian or vegan. We used beef gelatin. That's a caveat here, but we were able to make jewelry out of bioplastics, and so not using any synthetic materials. I could talk more about that, but I'm coming to the end of the presentation. So what can we do as individuals, right? I think I'm preaching to the choir here, right? We can, typically it's reduce, reuse, recycle, but it's actually more like refuse. So, say no to that plastic utensil if you can. Reduce, reuse, repair, right? Repair that old broken or that, the hole in your jeans if you can. And then, of course, recycle, right? For microplastics in particular, a big one is not eating food that's been heated up in plastic containers. So a small one will be avoid microwaving your plastic food containers. And then if possible, use something that isn't plastic to store your food. So glass, metal, I guess, wooden cutting boards maybe instead of plastic cutting boards. For your blankets or something that you put on your face, maybe consider using natural fibers because we breathe in a lot of the fibers that are made out of synthetic materials. And then a lot of microplastics in our homes get stored in the form of dust. So I have vacuum and dust here, but also if possible, you can use an air filter. There have been some evidence that common water filters can remove some microplastics, but it won't remove all the micro or nanoplastics, but it could help. And then this is the one I put for fun. Find alternatives to retail therapy. In other words, this is kind of like a slow down the amount of things you buy, go outside, physical movement, arts, connecting with community. A really good way to connect with community is to attend a coastal cleanup. So if you're looking for something that makes you feel like you're really helping and you're talking to your neighbors, you can consider signing up for a cleanup with some of your local organizations. And then just to end things, here's a beautiful photo of the Hudson River. Sometimes when I talk to kids, I'll tell them about how, believe it or not, the Hudson River was dirtier when my mom was a kid growing up in New York than it is now. Because when my mom was born in the 50s, there was no such thing as an environmental protection agency. We were still pumping a lot more sewage, a lot more chemicals into the Hudson than we do now. And so things are improving. I have, my optimism quote that I think we should leave this issue with a feeling of optimism and faith that will lead to achieving a better, healthier water system. With that, I am done. If there's any questions, I could try to turn on my camera again and see if we get the robot voice.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Catherine. Um, so yeah, now's a great time for people to put questions in the chat if they have any. I did collect a few beforehand from the registration page, so we can start off with those as folks type theirs out. The first one, which I thought was really interesting, was do you know of any microplastics free options for toothbrushing?
Oh, yeah. I've seen like bamboo, but what are the bristles made out of? Are the bristles made out of? Because I've started buying cotton floss.
Mm,
And so there might be toothbrush shop. I'll be totally transparent. I use like a totally plastic toothbrush, so I'm not sure. But that's a really good idea to look into whether or not there's the actual bristles themselves are made out of like a cotton. I know that there are non-plastic flosses out there if you're interested.
yeah. What I've read is the bamboo handles, yeah, as well as the bristles are made out of boar's hair, a very specific
Oh,
species of
yeah.
boar, and they disinfect and boil the hair and then put down a toothbrush, which is really strange to think about, but it could also be a very sustainable option. So
And it
thank you
probably
so
was how
much.
toothbrushes were made back prior to industrialization,
Right,
right?
right, exactly. And then another question was if there's any research or any supplements that are out about ways to flush microplastics out of our bodies.
Yeah, this is one that we get a lot, and I don't have an answer. I don't know. I do know that I get that question a lot, and so maybe within the next, gosh, future, that could be a service. I know that there are websites where you can apply to get your blood tested for microplastics. I don't know about flushing them out though, and I can't tell you to go to any service. I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. Another question that came up for me was I think it was earlier on in the presentation, you mentioned that there was a study in the Hudson River where they were looking at they were sampling for microplastics, and a lot of their data was not usable because they were working out their methodology and they were able to kind of pinpoint exactly how to conduct the study in the future. Is there now a standardized way of testing our waters for microplastics, or does that kind of vary water body to water body?
There's no standardized way.
Okay.
And that is that's like what the USGS, there's lots of research groups that are trying to develop that standardized method.
Yeah.
It varies per lab, and that's part of the problem when it comes to communicating and talking about this data is that it's different methods. And contamination is it's a real hurdle to overcome when it comes to microplastic research. So Yeah, there's been some recent studies that are like, your data's crap. It's all, you're actually just measuring your gloves. You're not measuring the real plastic in that system. And those studies are important. I don't think that it's time to throw out all of our data. I think we have some really good data out there, but I think it is really important to pay attention to the potential for contamination and for misreading a particle as a microplastic when it's actually a different kind of compound.
We have another minute or so if folks want to ask questions, but I'll also use this time to remind everyone that the recording for this will be available in a follow-up email that I'll send either tomorrow or sometime next week, as well as it'll be made available on the CCE Albany website with the past recording on food waste. As well as on May 28th, we have the third and final part of our Climate Bite webinar series, and that is on the relationship between climate impacts and aging populations and what makes our older populations more vulnerable. So it's a really, I think, underappreciated topic that we'll hear from a Cornell professor who specializes on this for that webinar. So be really interesting. We hope that you can join us for that. We'll take another minute for questions. And Catherine, if there's
Yeah,
anything else that you want to just, talk about in the last couple minutes here, go for it.
yeah, just here's my email if anybody wants to reach out. I do some, if anybody's a teacher or has a group that they educate, I do some kind of like interactive, let's measure microplastics. But yeah, I'd love to hear any feedback you have on the presentation or any questions you still have. So thank you all for joining. It's so great to spend an hour with you, even though I can't see you, and even though for part of it I was a robot.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Really appreciate it. This is great. I think with that, we'll say goodbye to everyone. We hope to see you next month.